Okay, we're going to get started. Thanks everyone for joining and welcome to the State of Open Data Policy Summit. I'm Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of the GovLab, Governance Laboratory here in New York, and I'm also the lead of the Open Data Policy Lab, which is hosting today's State of Open Data Policy Summit. For those who don't know, the Open Data Policy Lab, it's a recent initiative that we've created the last 2 years together with Microsoft in order to really unlock and unleash access to open data in order to reuse data for public interest purposes. The whole idea of the Open Data Policy Lab is to support decision makers at all levels and at all sectors as they are seeking to accelerate the responsible access and subsequent reuse of data for, as I already mentioned, public interest purposes. We also created the Open Data Policy Lab, given the realization that while great progress has been made in the area of open data, and we see increased access to also privately held data, we've also only have seen the tip of the iceberg as it relates to the data assets that could advance society and that could inform decision makers worldwide as it relates to solving public problems, whether it is a pandemic, or whether it is tackling climate change or any other kind of societal challenge that we are currently experiencing. In addition, we also have created the Open Data Policy Lab because we know that without constant vigilance and especially constant support to those leaders in the space, there is a great chance of actually backsliding on all the progress that has been made as it relates to open data. And that was also the message of a report that was released last week by the Global Data Barometer, who indicated that while progress had been made, the open data agenda has largely stalled worldwide in comparison with previous exercises that the Global Data Barometer had engaged. And so we need a concerted effort in order to install and especially to progress the open data agenda. And that was one of the reasons why we developed the Open Data Policy Lab. Now, in order to accelerate access to data and especially unlock some of the current situations we are in, the Open Data Policy Lab launched 2 years ago the third wave of open data, which is our way to really pinpoint on what are some of the priorities that we as a society should focus on, not only to increase access to data, but also to increase the impact of access to data as well. Now, the third wave of open data, frankly, has 4 key components, which we will touch upon throughout this summit as well. One is we need to move from just data and open data by default to more of publish with purpose, which means that we have to become more purpose-driven and intentional as it relates to our discussions and especially as it relates to our practices with regard to open data. The second element of what we believe could be the third wave of open data is to really focus on collaboration, focus on partnerships, especially in those areas where data might not be made openly available because of a variety of sensitivity and other concerns as well. So open data should be data collaboration in order to really facilitate and accelerate the kinds of access that we need in order to address the critical societal needs that we have. The third element of the third wave of open data, from our point of view, is where data responsibility needs to become front and center of the open data movement, where data responsibility not only means responsibility to prevent and protect misuse and protect those that could be harmed by making the data open, but it's also a responsibility about sharing data when there is a clear public interest as well. So the third element is really about responsibility from a broader perspective. And then the last element of what we call the third wave of open data is to also focus on the subnational level, but also focus on how the subnational level can connect with the national and even the supranational level, because we see increased silos and stovepiping at different levels, and that ultimately creates for fragmentation of the data ecosystem And so we need to have a much broader collaboration and coordination across subnational, national, and supranational efforts as it relates to open data. So those 4 elements are the elements that we at the Open Data Policy Lab have tried to advance in order to install and unlock the open data movement towards a new future, a future that is more focused on purpose, collaboration, and data responsibility. Now, in order to implement those elements, we've also invested in a variety of programs and projects, such as, for instance, we have developed a data stewards course where we really try to nurture that new profession that we feel is needed in order to be more purposeful and more collaborative. But we also instigated a few initiatives, for instance, at the city level through our city incubator that basically halted and closed a few weeks ago as well, where we could feature 10 innovations in 10 cities as it relates to the use of open data at subnational level as well. Now, throughout all those efforts at the Open Data Policy Lab, the big elephant quite often in the room is, of course, policy. How can we develop policy that incentivizes open data, and to what extent do we need policy in order to really provide that kind of impetus and also consistency as it relates to making data open? We get asked on a regular basis, what should be the ingredients of policy? How should we go about making policies as it relates to open data? How do we encourage access to privately held data without policies or with policies? What is the role of government? Do we need to develop policies at the sector base or more horizontal and vertical as well? And so those are the questions that we hope to address today, because we felt that those questions are recurrent and that many in the space are frankly at search for answers. And so we thought it would be good to convene many of you and also invite several leaders in the space to really reflect on what is the current state of open data policy, not just the current state of open data, but the current state of open data policy, and how does it impact the current state of open data as well. And so today we brought together high-level panels, 2 high-level panels, one that will focus on the open government data ecosystem with a focus mainly on public data, but then also a panel where we will focus on accessing privately held data for other purposes than initially intended. And so we will hope that through those panels, we will survey the current landscape, what is happening in the open data space, open data policy space, identify promising developments so that those that really want to become inspired on what to do within their own country or within their own city can actually also take away what could be possible pathways forward, and then also to develop some principles for the future. Because clearly we have now instigated a whole range of open data efforts for the last 10, 15 years. What have we learned and what do we need to take into account moving forward? What are the principles for open data policymaking moving forward? So those are the objectives of today. And as I already said, we have a whole range of panelists that will reflect on that. But in order to inform today, the Open Data Policy Lab also developed a new resource, which we launch as we're speaking right now, which is a repository of recent developments in the open data policy space. I mean, we get asked, as already mentioned, what is happening? Is anyone actually instigating some new legislation? Is it only a few regions that are leading, or can we learn from other regions? And so towards that end, we thought it would be good to actually capture and curate some recent developments worldwide in order to inform our current debate, but also to get a sense and a signal as it relates to the state of open data policy as well. And so the repository should be shared in the chat, and you can access it freely. It's a Google Doc at the moment as well, in order to make sure that it's also being perceived as something that will remain under development, because obviously our intent was not to be perfect, but was to iterate over time as new developments evolve as well. Now, looking at all those developments, there are already a few high-level takeaways, which we will discuss throughout the panels as well. The first takeaway, I guess, is that activity is present across the globe, right? In every region, we see that indeed there are activities with regard to open data legislation, but we also see that, of course, there are a few innovators in the space that really set the stage and the frame of reference with regard to how we go about open data, open sharing with regard to, for instance, privately held data. And we will reflect on some of those leaders and some of those models that are emerging throughout today as well. But it suffices to say that some of them, of course, are emerging at the supranational level, such as at the European Union level, but also within international organizations, such as, for instance, the OECD. And we will also reflect on how that impacts society, but also how countries impact supranational impact country kind of efforts as well. The second observation from my end, looking at the repository, is that despite the fact that COVID-19 was heralded as a watershed moment in the open data space, when suddenly everyone realized that we actually need data in order to make progress vis-a-vis, for instance, a pandemic, and that we didn't have the policies in place to really unlock some of the data assets that we needed, despite the fact that we just experienced that watershed moment, my sense is that the policy community is still running behind actually coming up with policies that would enable future access to data in order to tackle future dynamic threats as well. And so from my point of view, a key element of discussion today should be about how agile can the policy community become in order to really respond to some of those needs that we have identified during COVID as well. Now, the other, and I'm not going to go through the whole list of observations because otherwise we wouldn't have much to discuss, but I've just raised some of those in order to set the stage for the panels that will follow. Another is, of course, that most of the activities in the open data policy environment still focuses on government to society or government to citizens as well, i.e. the traditional open government data ecosystem, and that we see not that many initiatives that really try to, for instance, go to business to government or even government to government for that matter as well. And so we really need to take a broader lens to the whole concept of data and open data in order to stimulate access to those data sources that can make a difference as well. And the last observation is that obviously we are talking about different purposes, different cultures, and that one size or one model won't fit all the needs worldwide. And so we need to also become more sophisticated about what are the variables that makes a difference in how we go about open data policies that are geographically sensitive, culturally sensitive, but also take into account the purpose for which one needs the data as well. Now, all those observations are meant to just set the stage. And initially, we had hoped that we could kick off today's session with a keynote speech by US Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. Unfortunately, Senator Gillibrand had to go to Buffalo because of the tragedy that happened over the weekend there, and she had to join the President of the United States in order to comfort her constituency, but also raise the challenges that, of course, again, were present during this weekend's tragedy and mass shooting over there. And as such, we won't have the privilege to have Senator Gillibrand give the keynote speech. But what we will do is move straight into the first panel and then use the time in order to instigate a more longer and broader Q&A so that we have a real interactive session here about how we go about some of the issues that were raised in the panel as well. So let me, before I introduce the panel, also remind people, if I could go to the previous slide, remind people about some of the logistics and some of the elements that, of course, everyone here on the call probably already knows, given the fact that we all have become Zoom or remote video professionals. But first of all, the session will be recorded because others that couldn't join today might also want to be aware of what was discussed. So everything is going to be recorded and will be able to be viewed afterwards as well. For those who have questions, and we hope many of you will engage in an interactive way, please raise those questions in the Q&A. If you have general observations or you want to share some of the resources that you have also produced, feel free to also share that in the chat, or indeed introduce yourself in the chat so that we know who is actually participating today as well, in order to facilitate that kind of community engagement as well. And lastly, please mute your microphone if you're not speaking as well, which I think is probably an automatic function of today's session as well, but that also applies to the panelists that are currently present as well. Now, without further ado, let us start it. And I'm delighted to introduce our first panel here, which, as you can see, is a very high-level panel representing a variety of stakeholders and a variety of experiences. And so I'm delighted to introduce Catherine Steeler, who is the CEO of Creative Commons, but also, of course, have a long-standing open data background, having been the leader of Open Knowledge, and before that has been leading several of the legislative initiatives also at the European Parliament. We also have Jerry Pilar, and I hope, Jerry, I pronounced your name correctly, on the panel, who represents the European Commission, where he is a legal and policy officer. We also have Charlie Marshall Ngugunu, who is joining us from Kenya, and who is an executive president of the Afro Leadership. And we also expect Barbara Ubaldi to be here any moment. I think she is running a few minutes late as well, and will be joining us. And she is the Digital Government and Open Data Lead at the OECD. Now, if I could ask the panelists to switch on their video in order to get started, then we can immediately get going here as well. Great. Thanks so much, Catherine, Jerry, and Charlie for joining this panel. And let me start perhaps with Catherine. Normally I was planning on starting with Barbara, but ladies first as my fundamental rule, which is why I wanted to start with you, Catherine, really whether you have been, anyway, as I mentioned, a leader in the space for quite a while. And you've seen, anyway, both within your current situation as the CEO of Creative Commons, but previously also in your leadership at as the Open Knowledge Foundation, seen a variety of developments, and eager to get your broader overview of where are we with regard to open data, and more specifically, what's your sense on the current state of open data policy? Let's get started there, perhaps with a broader kind of overview before we go into some of the details. And then I can ask Jerry about some of the European developments and Charlie about the African angle here as well. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Stefan, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you all today. Maybe some reflections I'm having when we are thinking about open data, particularly around the open democracy space, and where open data plays such a central part about how we hold those to account, but also how we use that information. And I keep coming back to how are we being heard, because the policy space is an interesting one. And as someone who was a policy maker before coming into the not-for-profit world, it's fascinating, also sometimes troubling, how the perception of policymakers is held by some of the policy community, partly because at the moment the frustration over having very much evidence-based policy, but that not being sometimes heard. And I raise this because it's something which I'm certainly reflecting on just now about how can we be better at influencing. And it's brilliant that we've got Jerry here, who is working, I think, on the Data Act as we speak, because here's a place and space where we can have influence and where we can have impact. And this is a great opportunity, I believe, for those who are advocating for open data to see some changes, but also talk about why it's important in the places and spaces that we're working within, wherever you are globally today. And so when I'm thinking about policy making, I think often about how are we influencing? Because policy making is, as you know, all about the people. It's about building relationships and it's about building trust. And if ever there's something that is so trusted, it is open data, because that is where we can make impact and solve some of the pressing problems that we're facing today. I mean, I could go on, Stefan, but I thought, I just think there's something about where open data is that wasn't there 20 odd years ago, but which is here today. Even although we're not seeing movement, there is an argument to be made about why that is central for open societies. And we saw what happened with the G7 last year about the Open Societies Declaration. Mm-hmm. And we can think more intentionally about those arguments, about how we can be thinking how we're communicating and messaging about open data in the world that we're existing within today. I hope that's helpful to set some of my thinking at the moment.
No, I think it is very helpful, Catherine, and it is also very helpful to get your perspectives, having been a policymaker, yes, and now also on in the nonprofit kind of environment. But from your perspective, also would like to get your sense. Meaning, so you mentioned the Data Act, and I will yes, call upon Jerry. Yes. In a second, and especially also, it's not just the Data Act, it's also the Data Governance Act, which yes, was, of course, approved yesterday by the Council as well. Yes. But from your perspective, do you feel that the policymakers are aware of the importance of policymaking in the space of open data as well? And is there enough guidance actually in order to steer them into areas that would make a difference? And I think it would be interesting to hear from Jerry as well on, so how do policymakers even, get the expertise to know what to instigate that doesn't lock in open data? Because that's one of the concerns that we also have seen, is that it is an emerging field. And if yes, we lock it in, then actually we will ignore some of the developments that could actually accelerate open data, and it becomes more of a compliance as opposed to an innovative space as well.
Yeah, I think that that's a very good question. I think that that there is still work to do. So those who are already very involved, and I would say if you take the European example, those that are leading in terms of the rapporteurs and the shadow rapporteurs, and the people that are working in those political groups who are often the unseen people who are working behind the scenes, as well as often the teams of people that are working behind the politicians, who are really kind of, are really key to so much of things getting done. Those are the converted, and sometimes often that they are willing to listen. It's the others that sometimes have to have simple messaging about why it's important, particularly if you're, we're talking here about all levels of political engagement. And as you know, a lot of politics is local politics. And so, you've talked about your work you've been doing in cities. You've talked about sometimes it's the storytelling around the impact of what you have been doing and some of the work that you've been doing, Stefan, that can be actually most helpful when we're trying to say why this issue is important. And I think we exist in a political world. And today, if you take the EU as an example, what is dominating, it's the war in Ukraine, it's misinformation, disinformation. Well, open data helps us to tackle the misinformation and disinformation world that we're existing within. And if we can have a framing of what we're doing around some of those subjects, then you're more likely to be heard by those who are not already the converted who are working in some of these issues, but who are wanting to understand why this issue or these areas are important. And that's where where we're working in terms of relationship building. I mean, it struck me now, as you know, I'm leading Creative Commons, and, you know, we see, you know, kind of how important we've just been doing some work on open journalism, and, you know, open information, open data is so important in terms of how we are enabling, you know, the truth to be heard. As I think Brewster Kahle used a brilliant word recently about how the truth, the truth is hidden behind paywalls, and I think, you know, something about how are we evidencing our importance by being relevant to today's problems as well. I hope that's helpful, Stefan, because I keep coming back to the fact that, of course, our work is so important in terms, but how are we framing it? How are we engaging? And how can we do that better?
Thanks so much, Catherine. And yeah, and I realize I put you there on the spot as well, getting this started, but I think it was a really good framing of why it matters, right? And I think that's always something that we need to go back to on what's the value proposition. It's not just about policy, it's about the purpose for which we need policy. And so going to you, Jury, I mean, your name has already been dropped a few times by Catherine as well. And of course, Europe has been extremely busy and active as it relates to data policy and data strategy. And of course, the Data Act was released and published in February. And so eager to hear from you, Jury, what was the impetus? What were some of the, anyway, issues that you seek to address, not only with the Data Act, but also with the Data Governance Act? And are there, anyway, other models, or were there models out there that informed how you go about? Because clearly it seems to be like what you are trying to do in Europe is quite often like the pioneering first step with regard to a new policy environment. But would be interested to see, anyway, whether some models that informed you as you were developing the data governance and the Data Act as well. Over to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks for having me. Indeed, I'm working in the European Commission in the small team relatively that is preparing the data policy for Europe. Well, I have to say we cannot speak from the bed about the high ideas and the great moral principles, because what we do here, we try to create a European single market for data. But of course, you cannot avoid things like democracy, transparency, human rights, rule of law, and this is everything all very dear for us, and we are happy if we can help pursue these goals as well. And I think also that's the role of European Union in the world. Well, since you were dropping my name, I have to also applaud organizations like yours, Stefan, or your previous work, of course, and the work of Catherine. And I think it's no secret that we are now promoting Creative Europe license, Creative Commons licenses across our work. Because yeah, we arrived from the general policy on open data saying that public sector bodies should try to make their data available as long as they can, not charge too much for it if they can. We are getting to the place where we are really saying, okay, these are the data that you really should make available under very friendly conditions, typically under Creative Commons conditions and for free and machine readable. And we are now identifying those data that member states should be looking at as a preference now. We are also following developments in member states and also in the neighbor countries of the EU. It's the annual exercise called Open Data Maturity. And there again, you can see how the policy developed over the, I believe, 7 or 8 years that this is running, because in the beginning, we were basically looking at the open data portals. Do you have an open data portal? Do you have some data on it? Nice. Do you have some metadata? Maybe. But now we are looking at things like impact of the data that you're having on your portal, on the quality and not only quantity of the data on the portal. And this goes also together with the licensing conditions. But here we are still talking about the public sector data. But the Commission is now, after several policy documents, which are non-binding, of course, we arrived to the situation where we realize, okay, now we need to look at data held by other actors, typically researchers. In the beginning, it was easier because they were publicly funded mostly. But now we are also getting to data held by the private sector, where we discovered some bottlenecks. That's why we came with the Data Governance Act and the Data Act. I know there has been a little bit of inflation of proposals that have data in the name and act in the name. So maybe just a quick overview of what is in the Data Governance Act. There, for example, we want to make it possible for reusers or researchers to get to the data that is closed, that is not open, but still you can get some interesting insight from it. And if you respect some conditions like security, not using the data for some other things that would be really non-compatible, you can still get to the data and find out something interesting from it. And we, of course, we put in place conditions how to go about it when you want to do this. The next thing would be the possibility to get to the data from people, and the people then can use specific forms and specific procedures to donate their data for some interesting and public interest purpose. The next thing is increasing trust in data intermediaries, because we have been observing for a number of years that there are some data intermediaries that can join those who need data with those who have data. But there's not enough trust when you just find some company on the internet, right? So we put in place a mechanism where you can get some kind of endorsement that you are really doing things according to laws and that you respect all rules in place, such as GDPR and others. Then we can get to the Data Act, and here we are really going closer and closer to B2B, and we can see that the data is not only the things that we write down or the pictures that we take. The data is largely connected by machines today, and here the Data Act will make it easier for me or you to get to the data that machine or IoT object collects on you. It will also make it easier to port it somewhere else to another provider, and it will make it easier in a B2B relationships to get to the data from other companies. It will also make it more difficult for bigger companies to impose unfair contractual terms with respect to their data. It will also make it easier for the public sector, and we are slightly going back to the public sector. It will make it easier for them to get the data from the private sector for some public interest purpose, such as reacting to emergencies or improving some urgent policy goals. And last but not least, we also deal with some issues dealing with the switching of cloud providers. So this would be just a high-level overview of what all these data acts and data governance acts, etc., are doing. As you noticed, there's a move from the strictly governmental data to looking at the data as it is, data coming from anywhere.
Great. Thanks so much, Jerry, for that overview. And I'm sure there will be probably several questions with regard to some of the provisions as well. And just for clarity, the Data Governance Act has been approved, but the Data Act is still under review as far as I understand. Exactly. And quite often, Jerry, there is this whole, and that also sets the stage perhaps with what I will ask to Charlie. There's this whole discussion about you have the European model and then you have other models, right? And so from my perspective, Jerry, how would you define the European model vis-a-vis other models that are out there with regard to handling data? I mean, it seems like you already, anyway, started off by saying it's really about the single market approach. but wonder if someone would ask you, so what's so unique about the European model, right, of data policy making? Meaning, are there some elements that you feel are worth stressing as well? And then I might get Charlie involved to see whether, anyway, within the African continent, whether there are other models emerging as well, or also what's the current state of open data there. But over to you, Jerry.
That's a very good question. And it leads me to a concept that we announced in the communication some 2 years ago, and that we are now trying to fulfill with all these policy, legal, but also funding initiatives. Is the concept of common European data space. So here we are looking at a place where the data can flow between different sectors, between different countries and different categories of data holders. The data will know where to go in terms of technology. So there will be computing and data processing capabilities in place. There should be also some support. So we are now putting together a support center for these data spaces. These data spaces will have, of course, some specific sectoral rules, because it's different if you are dealing with finance data, or if you are dealing with climate data or public administration data. But there should also be each time some horizontal rules, such as the one that I mentioned in the Data Governance Act or in the Data Act. And the data will be flowing both from the individuals or companies, but also from the public sector, thanks to open data directive and open data policies. So as a result of this work on the data space, you will have a lot of data, high quality data. You will know what you can do with the data. You will know what you cannot, and you will know where to go to get the data. And you will have also technical tools to deal with the data. So we are trying to have this really complete look at the data landscape, and that's why we are making it, building it from all these different bricks that I've just mentioned.
Great, thanks so much, Jerry. And I will probably come back to some of those elements on the data spaces, as well as a kind of an emerging model of data collaboration, which I think is definitely something that, as you know, we have raised within our third wave of open data as a priority moving forward as well. But over to you, Charlie, and thanks for your patience here. Thanks, Charlie, from joining us from Kenya, where you, of course, anyway, not only in Kenya, but in Cameroon and the rest of the African continent, have been a leader in advancing open data. And so eager to hear from you, how is open data policy evolving within the African continent? How are leaders like yourself involved and engaged in actually shaping those policies? And then thirdly, and I know I'm a very bad moderator asking 3 questions always at the same time, but thirdly, perhaps because they are related, do you see the evolution of perhaps an African open data policy model as well? Because I think it's interesting to see whether different continents, different locations, different cultures might actually have different sensitivities and approaches to how they go about data. I'm eager to hear whether that resonates with you as well. But and Charlie, why don't we start with you, if you're still there, realizing that internet access, because you're on the road, might be an issue. Charlie, are you still there? I think Charlie has had great insights, but and was eager to join, but then I think internet failed here, unfortunately. Let's go back to you then, Catherine, and then we will have, I will add additional questions to Charlie. Then I will not have 3, but 5 questions for him whenever he's back. But Catherine, meaning you've been responding to the Data Act as being a a step in the right direction, especially as it relates to also control of data.
Yeah.
And so eager to hear what you meant by the right direction, and then connected a little bit with the licensing space, right? Because clearly licensing is a device of policy making as well. And so interesting to see how you feel licensing fits within the open data policy ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because data, when we think about copyright, data is usually not copyrightable. So usually, I say usually.
Right.
And if it is, then, our CC0 license is often applied. And so, how do we look at the protection of databases? And that was addressed actually when we looked at the reversioning, particularly being the EU sui generis right included in the 4.0 version of the licenses. So there's something about, at the moment, there's a lot of talk about article, correct me if I'm wrong, is Article 35 of the proposal, where thinking about this, how do we address that particular clause over the sui generis clause? And so there's something I think people are getting motivated around about how the thinking, what needs to be revised, what needs to be thought about. And clearly there's a process, we're waiting, there's, I think for a lot of you on the call, you probably understand that, there's the council process, the member states are thinking about the Data Act. And meanwhile, the European Parliament is thinking about the Data Act, and the commission that makes the proposal is almost just sitting there waiting to see what happens. And so there's points and inflections of influence. There's the influence when the rapporteur is drafting the report, and clearly the particular article where kind of some of those who advocate for openness sees an opportunity of reform or so I think when I was talking about opportunity, Stefan, I was thinking particularly about where can we influence and what can we do at this moment. And so we'll wait for the rapporteur. I can't, maybe Eureka, you can inform us about the timetable at the moment. I haven't been an MEP for 3 years, so I kind of am watching from afar. But I think that there's a moment where the rapporteur is drafting the report. There's the moment when the report's there, and the political groups then start to look at what they will put down and how, and then the whole thing comes together with a vote in committee, a vote in the Parliament, and then it will probably go to a first reading. I would think a first reading, consensus, and therefore after that you come through with the final proposal. I say all of that very quickly, but you know that these things take a very long time sometimes, and huge amount of work is going on behind the scenes to make some of these things work in practice. So when we're thinking about you talked about data spaces, I always like to think about data commons and think about where that public interest is served and how what shape that looks like. But here's the thing, if you think about research and data is not just in that European space, it's a global collaboration. So how are we going to make sure that, say, on the issue of climate, and we are doing a piece of work at the moment at Creative Commons on how do we open up climate data. One of our pressing problems at the moment is the climate crisis. And although there's other issues at the moment that are the political front and center, the climate crisis is still the most pressing problem that humanity is facing at the moment. And yet so much data is hidden behind paywalls. How are we going to open up climate and biodiversity data to be able to tackle that challenging problem? And at the moment, Creative Commons is with IFL and with Spark in North America working together in partnership to try and have a campaign. And we're very grateful to have Monica leading that campaign for us in terms of what we can do to kind of tackle that pressing problem. But I go back to your question about how do we influence, and the opportunity is the moment is that we have a piece of law that is working its way, which has the potential to create a global standard. And therefore that's the opportunity to have an influence at this moment.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Charlie, I don't know whether you can, whether your internet allows you to be part, and I apologize for you disappearing for a second here. And so I asked you 3 questions, but feel free to answer just one. But the real interesting element that I would like to emphasize is your views, Charlie, on how open data policy is evolving within the African continent from your perspective, and whether there are some lessons from your long-standing leadership here on open data that you feel needs to be emphasized.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, and apologize for internet connection. Here, Kisumu is a very little secondary city in Kenya, and I think as people are getting back home, it's 7 p.m. As people are going back home, I think the bandwidth is very low. And so when it comes to the experience that we have in Africa, it's very, very much dispersed. You know, it's very much dispersed and very much fragmented. And you know, the difference of America, China, you know, European Union, those big blocks, you know, we don't actually have a kind of comprehensive continental policy making for data. And with the support of UNICA and UNDP few times back, you know, from 2016, 2017, there was a dynamic around a African data relation report, you know, trying to assess the landscape and push our countries, you know, to really build a continental wide, you know, policy around open data. And basing this on the transformation of our national, we actually have capacity around data, because when we talk of open data, we usually put on the board the fact that there are less, you know, capacity in Africa, but here in Africa, our national statistic offices has been the key driver of everything around data. So now, given the constraints that we have, for me, the first constraint, given the fact that you were talking of collaboration today around open data, the constraint is that our countries are very much fragmented. And so we don't reap the great opportunities that exist around collaborating around for open data continent-wide, you know, continent-wide, because that's where lie most of the benefits. We can't just be talking of the kind of policies that we are trying to build in countries, you know, in countries as we are doing, because that will give us to be running at very different pace. And when it comes to policy making, that will certainly keep us behind and leading us actually behind this open data dynamic. And what we see is that information technology is actually overpassing our policy making capacity. Because what you see is, when I compare what is happening in Europe and in US or in China, just to take those 3 big blocks, I see clearly that policy making is quite a daily exercise. And today, when they link with data or information technology or everything around technology, around platforms, around social media, around digital market, we see clearly that policy making is a daily job. But when you come in the continent, in Africa, you don't see this as a daily job. That means for policymakers, it is not something that is permanently on their table. And that's why you will see few countries will take a lead today for policymaking, and then afterward, you won't hear of it anymore. And that has happened with so many countries. Even though we see clearly that South Africa is always leading the game, we see clearly that Kenya is on. We see also that few Francophone countries like Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire, for example, you know, they have been pushing for open government and then open data in the framework of the Open Government Partnership. And those are very great exceptions when you look at this from the perspective of policy making. But that being said, we have kind of empirical exercises too, because in Africa you have about 35 countries with data portals, but at different level of viability or credibility. When you look at it from the perspective of quality, of data quality, you will probably observe that most of those platforms or maybe data portal are not updated, and that, you know, it has started and then it has stopped, and you see that from year to year, you will see that you have same data set in the portal. And at times that's because it is not actually home taught. You know, those are usually data portal deal with the support of a technical partner, of technical and financial partner, like African Development Bank a few years back, you know, decided to push namely our National Statistic Office to build, and you have it on their platform. Even our National Statistic Office, they even use the platform built with the support of African Development Bank as their open portal. And so you will see clearly that this doesn't stem from a national data-driven policy. So we need to push this and to make sure we can technically or practically get involved in the global data policy making that is going on. We need forcefully collaboration, because collaborating with all those big blocks will, first of all, put our case on the table. Because why we are lagging, or maybe why we are taking our time to build policies that will drive our efforts around data for better life in Africa. We see clearly that your countries there, your Western countries or Asia or European Union, you are making very great strides, enlarging the gap that exists between your context and our context, and putting us absolutely in a state of being recolonized again in a domain, in a sector that is where every advance is an abyssal one. And so we need collaboration. We cannot count on our capacity to build those policies. That's why when you talk in your introductory remarks that we need collaboration, I think that's the best way to go, so that we build a global policy framework, global data governance framework that will be imposed to all contexts, so that we go on kind of equal foot. Because for now, it's clear that we have very less capacity, and our policy making mechanism is not yet adjusted to the pace of current technological breakthrough. And that's the problem that we have. So we are using technology when we get to use it without the framework needed to orient or maybe to direct technology to purposes. That's a problem that we have. So we might have purposes. Those are, just like empirical purposes, by this policymaker or by this governance, but actually we don't have a comprehensive policy that will drive our own use or maybe our own design of data. That's the key that I want to put here to put in the door here.
Thanks so much, Charlie. And you made some really important points, which I would like to get the response, and then I will go and pick up some of the questions that were posted in the Q&A. But I think one key takeaway, Charlie, from your remarks is actually the need for not just think about continental, which of course are important policies, but also global collaboration, and with regard to some kind of a framework that would guide data and access to data globally. And I think the second big takeaway from my point of view, anyway, there are many, but I just want to surface here, is the need to be to have a consistent and iterative focus on data, and that we cannot just declare victory because we have an act that, anyway, the environment is changing as a result of technology, and we need to actually consistently look into how do we update existing frameworks and how do we stay ahead of the curve, which is of course a challenge from a policymaking point of view. But so eager to go to you, Jiri, with regard to Charlie's reflection on also the need to think about global policy frameworks, and then also actually think about collaboration. I mean, I know, of course, European Union is doing a lot of collaboration with the African continent, and to what extent, for instance, even EU-Africa kind of collaborations could be and are being established as it relates to, for instance, open data policy frameworks, and whether you are aware of that. But let's reflect on the global nature here, which also goes back, by the way, to what I think Catherine was saying, which is that if you want to deal with global problems like climate, and then you have fragmentation of data frameworks, you might not be able to actually deal with them from a data perspective as well. At least that's my understanding, Catherine, of what you were pointing to. Jiri.
Well, this question of global framework, it's probably going above what the EU or the European Commission can do on its own, but we are trying to contribute to it little by little. We sometimes speak with Open Government Partnership. We are always very happy to exchange ideas and best practice with any country that comes to us. We have spoken with Canada just last week. I've seen one of the colleagues from Canada here at this meeting. We have spoken with Brazil, Taiwan. I don't remember anyone from Africa yet. It's a pity. I think that we could develop much more the relationship with Africa. But apart from these really global considerations, it's quite important to say that open data now found its way to free trade agreements. So the last couple of free trade agreements that we have been talking about with countries around the world, the last ones that I recall is Canada, Australia and New Zealand. There is now a provision on open government data where, of course, it's an international agreement, so it's relatively soft, but the countries acknowledge there the importance of open data for economy and society, and they acknowledge that they need to make their data available under reuse-friendly conditions. So all this is there. Apart from that, we have been in a much more narrow relationship with neighboring countries. So the countries that are in a closer neighborhood to the European Union. So there it's much easier for us because we have some kind of instrument to speak with them and involve them in our programs. I'm speaking about the Balkans, Caucasus countries, and Ukraine as well. Ukraine was very advanced in open data, and let's hope it will remain so. So yeah, that would be my take on the global right now. Otherwise, we can lead by example.
Right.
That's
Maybe the other thing, Jiri, is the ACP as well, where you've got a parliamentary assembly. I think they just met, actually, it was at the beginning of April maybe, and that's an opportunity at an EU level to have that kind of collaboration. Any MEP, I believe, can put on an agenda item in that parliamentary assembly, and so something like open data or the Data Act or something which gets, again, another voice. Sometimes we forget about the delegations at the EU level, and you just mentioned some of those, and I just think the EU ACP Parliamentary Assembly is a great opportunity to put forward some of these issues as well.
Great. And I have many more questions, but I do want to make sure that this becomes a conversation also with the audience here. And I think we had already a few open questions still. One is with regard to how we, anyway, the frame we talk about data, right? And so Michael Nelson indicates that some of the memes or metaphors that we are using with regard to data sharing actually hampers data sharing, right? So either data is the new oil or some notion of control with regard to agencies' data. And so wondering whether, anyway, we actually have the right vocabulary to talk about data sharing that incentivize data sharing, and even the whole concept of sharing, right? From my point of view, might in itself actually create concerns, because in some cases, data is not shared, it's just made accessible, right? And so interesting from a policy point of view, because I do want to make sure that we always focus on the state of open data policy, whether anyway, the way we frame data and data sharing matters and how we would go about this. Catherine.
Yeah, no, it certainly does. And I think the language around that, and I think Mike is right about that the oil analogy is not helpful. And I think that there is something when we are considering reflecting on, as someone who runs an organization which is all about sharing, and how we do that in our strategy is about better sharing, about how we can do things in a more intentional way, but also not to get away from the fact that sharing in terms of what we do in terms of knowledge and culture, it, helps us build on more knowledge and culture and creativity. And we shouldn't lose sight of some of that. And clearly 20 years ago, the privacy debate is now very different than what it was 20 years ago, where it is today. And we have to very much take on board a lot of what our responsibility with that too. But I keep thinking about sharing, the way I see sharing in terms of knowledge and culture, research, and all of those things, is about sharing for generosity. And I think today we're also seeing, sharing for profit. And so there's something about how do we, as someone who's running an organization, about the commons, the public domain, the public good, the public interest, Creative Commons is a public interest technology. How are we differentiating some of that and show, and maybe that's where we get the language about how we're doing it for the public interest. And you said this, Stefan, about the public interest, the data commons, the public good. How do we get that language around that also is explaining more clearly about what we are doing is helping society, whereas some of the things that we're seeing has been detrimental. And that's something that we want to kind of show the differentiation over.
Great. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for that, Catherine. And indeed, I think, exactly me. So it's like it depends on what you share, data for, right? And I do, the whole notion of Creative Commons, the fact that it has the commons in its name is kind of a way to frame what it's about, right? Michael, also, or actually, why don't I go to the next question of Yusra? And again, Charlie and Jerry, feel free to chime in if there's a question that you also want to answer that I don't call upon you. But how do we ensure ethical use of data and protection of the public when pushing for an acceleration in availability of open data, which is, of course, the perennial kind of question, which is how do you actually open data without undermining some of the data protection provisions? And Charlie, you have raised your hand, so why don't I give you the floor immediately?
Thanks. I just start on a view by Brian, and I was telling Brian that I agree that there are many initiatives, that have started, but since I was part of the open data, data revolution report in Africa. It started 2015-16 with the support of UNICA, and I even said that. I'm not saying we are doing nothing. In every country, even in Cameroon, in all our countries, there are things going on. The problem is the practical implementation of all those initiatives. I was part of those movements. I was even there when we talk of UNICA at Addis Ababa, looking at this aspect of continental-wide policy. But few years after, you will notice that we don't actually have the comprehensive. We are still in the making of those continental initiatives. I agree on that. There are things being done. But our issue is we need to we need to go fast and faster because technology is moving. Data is being generated by so many technology, and there is a current and permanent and increasing privatization of data in Africa. And when you look, I could take something, you know, a specific aspect where Stefan and I are working on. You know, when you look at mapping data, today, mapping data are actually privatized by the GovLab and their likes. So if we don't actually build our policies, if we don't implement them, we see clearly that we are very reluctant to build, to implement, to adopt, to ratify, and to localize our policies, even when they are continentally built. And I would take the example of the Malabo Convention on Cybersecurity, and that you know all. Till now, up to now, it was voted in 2014. Up to now, 8 years later, we don't even have 15 countries that have signed on. And so that's a problem in Africa. That's why I'm talking of this, you know, of this situation where we don't have these continental-wide policies being designed and implemented as top priorities, given the pace of the dynamics that unfold around us, especially when we talk of technology. And when we talk of technology, when we also talk of data-fed technology, like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all the tools around. And we know that if we don't build our framework, our data-driven framework, we will be out of next wave of technology. Stefan is talking of that wave of open data, but we will be out of the next wave of technology since data are actually the food for technology today, as everything is being automated, as machines are being trained. And if we don't have our own, we will be excluded. And those are my fears, my dear Brian. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks for this conversation with Brian as well, which was about, anyway, to what extent, how do we evaluate progress made? And I think there is indeed, anyway, a longer conversation to be had with regard to what's happening on the ground and what's happening at the policy level, and how do they influence each other as well, which is a bigger conversation. But Jerry, why don't I go to you? And I think it goes back to the earlier question with regard to how do we release data while at the same time, anyway, stay put as it relates to data protection. And there was also, which is a quite often raised concern, is that some of the data protection provisions actually hampered the kind of data innovation that one seeks to establish now. And so wonder whether you have any views on that, or anyway, of course, meaning it might be hard within the European Commission kind of context, but whether you feel the anyway, the sequence that Europe had, which was actually initially strong, anyway, data protection provisions, and then now, anyway, building upon that, looking into more opening up of the data, whether that sequence makes sense, or whether we should, anyway, do this in more parallel, iterative kind of fashions. Over to you, Jerry.
That's a very important and a very tough question at the same time. Because as you know, the data protection was not invented with the GDPR. It's been around for the last 30 years. And of course, even before, people were very wary of what is available about them. The same thing goes for transparency of the public sector. It's been around, for example, in the company data for the last 60 years. When I speak only about European directives, of course, business registers existed already before. And it's been, I think it has been a perennial question. What do you make open? What do you make available? And what you will better keep closed? And this question has never been solved until this day. What is very clear is that when we create conditions for the data economy, and we want to make sure that the flow and use of data is not hampered. At the same time, we always have to think about the privacy, security, safety of data, ethical standards. So this can never slip away from our minds, because otherwise we will not build a data economy that works. So what we have to do in each basically legislative instrument, we have to repeat that data protection rules continue to apply. And then it needs to be decided typically on a case-by-case basis. So there's always some guidance from the European Data Protection Board or the European Data Protection Supervisor. And we always try to keep some leeway to member states to solve this question as it suits them. Because even though we have one regulation for the whole European Union, the approach, where do you find the balance between transparency and personal data protection is in every country a little bit different. We have noticed that Nordic countries are much more relaxed about publishing data about people that in some southern countries would be totally outrageous to publish about people. And we do not want to find one spot for everyone, which we would impose and which would in the end not really fit any member state. So we try to keep some flexibility in this. Unfortunately, the pendulum is moving in both directions. And for example, when you look at beneficial ownership data, where there was a very strong trend over the years to make it more and more open and more accessible. Now we are seeing that there is rather a trend how to make sure that data on people who are in those registers are rather well protected and not openly accessible to anyone who comes by, and not available in a bulk. So this is it's kind of a minefield we are working in. And when we want to impose some really sweeping obligation in terms of openness, at the end of the day, we need to put some ground rules, which are relatively minimal, but then encourage whatever member states want to do on top of that. So this is kind of a difficult environment that we are working in right now.
Great, thanks so much, Jerry. And I think indeed, the open data policy space as a minefield, I think, is probably the right kind of metaphor to think about it, because indeed there are multiple interests at stake, right, that need to be navigated, and I think it's this balancing act that is really the hard one to figure out, which is probably why we need perhaps more of, anyway, which is one of the reasons why we had this summit today, is to actually have more of this kind of public deliberations about what are the challenges at stake, so that you have more of an informed, deliberative kind of perhaps conversation and debate to be had. We are running out of time here with this panel, and I could anyway go on with this panel. Even Barbara didn't even join us, and so imagine how much time we would have with also to anyway integrate the OECD perspective here. But as the last question to all of you, given the fact that the Open Data Policy Lab really wants to think in terms of what are some of the areas that requires further this kind of deliberation and consideration, eager to hear from all of you if there is one topic that you would recommend moving forward, that if we would be able to have a broader and deeper understanding of how to go about it, would solve some of the issues, what would be the topic, right? And again, you have 1 minute, and I know this is a very hard question. And as I always say, this is a question I hate to get myself, but that's why I'm always posing it to others. But what would be like one topic that you says, look, or one area, if we would make progress there, that it would anyway would make a big difference? And also feel free, the ones indeed in the audience, feel free to put your one topic there in the chat as well. Catherine, I started with you, so over to you.
And the clock is ticking. Well, I mentioned our work on open climate, and I think that if we could do more work with yourself, Stefan, and really, you know, it's an opportunity, it's a challenge, and we know the climate crisis is a huge challenge to us all. But if there was a space in place and opening more climate data so we can solve some of the pressing problems around our climate challenges, I think that's an area of great focus and great interest, bringing new people into the debate as well.
Great. Charlie. Oh, Charlie is frozen, unfortunately.
Yes.
Oh,
thank you, Stefan. And I think, hello?
Yeah. We can say.
Hello, do you get me?
Yeah. Meaning.
Okay.
You're creating quite some suspense.
So that internet don't go. Yeah. And I think my fear is the fact that when I see the bloc that you constitute there, US, Europe, and China, you can fight back the GAFAM. For now, I don't see that Africa can fight back those GAFAM. It's difficult. So my takeaway here is, or my proposal on the table is that we organize this big collaboration for a global policy, data policy that will, create a playing level field where we know the risks, the global risks, so that each continent doesn't protect itself the way I see it now, so that we protect everyone, every region from the risk of the data-driven economy.
Great, thanks so much. Jerry, you have the last word, no pressure.
That's great. I was thinking also about some sectoral issues going together with climate, like energy or agriculture. But if I could have even a bigger wish, I would like you to work on the role of human in all of this, because you always try to say that this should be human-centric policy. And I think if every one of us can find himself or herself in the policy actually, and not seeing some high-level themes that sound good, but I don't know immediately where do I stand or where do I fit into it. Yeah, I think that would be great to ensure also the role and rights of individuals in the whole, different parallel data policies, including the open data one.
Wonderful. Great. Well, 3 big challenges here, 3 big ambitions. Thanks for sharing. Catherine, Jerry, Charlie, thanks for being on the panel. And let me move to the, this was very insightful. Let me move to the next part of today's summit, which is our keynote speaker. And if I can ask Catherine, Jerry, and Charlie to switch off your video so that we can, thanks so much, we can ask Juan to join. And our keynote speaker today is Juan La Vista Ferres, who is the Chief Scientist and Lab Director of the Microsoft AR for Good Research Lab, where he works with a whole range of scientists and researchers on AI, machine learning, and statistical modeling, including leading the Microsoft AI for Good efforts. And I know that Juan has strong views and opinions about open data and the need for advancing the whole open data ecosystem, in part because of the work that he has done at Microsoft, but also in part of some of the work that he has done in a variety of research capacities, including his pioneering work around SIDS, the Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, where he has pioneered the use of AI and data to identify and possibly prevent the unfortunate syndrome as well. Now, with that, over to you, Juan. I know you had some slides that you wanted to share, and I hope that will work here as well. And I will put my video or cancel my video so that not everyone sees me, but that they see you, because you're the main speaker here. Juan, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks you for the invitation. Can you hear me and can you see the screen, like the PowerPoint?
I cannot see the screen. I cannot see the screen, unfortunately.
You cannot see the screen. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, can you see the screen now?
Yeah, now we can see your screen. That's the
okay.
the challenge of multiple screens.
Exactly. Okay, well, thank you very much again for the invitation. And I will be talking briefly, not just about open data, but the need, a little bit about explaining the need of open data. And give me 1 second because this is not working. Okay. So every time we open a newspaper these days, we find amazing stories about the power of data, AI, open data. And of course, only this is partially true, partially hype, and a huge amount of jargon. The first question I want to try to answer today is, why do we have so much jargon? And this happened for 2 reasons. The first one is we are addicted to complicated projects. We like complicated things. This is the reason why we put a man on the moon before we added wheels to your luggage. And the second reason is because we want to look sophisticated. There's nothing better to looking sophisticated than creating your own jargon. When you go to Starbucks these days, instead of small, medium, and large, we have to order coffee as tall, grande, and venti. And even though Starbucks has been using these coffee sizes for the last 20 years, there's still a huge amount of people that go online and search for the meaning of these coffee sizes. And we know that because some people use Microsoft services to do that. So this desire to look sophisticated plus our addiction to complicated projects leads to jargon, and the problem with jargon leads to confusion. So the first lesson is, if we want to impress people, your solutions can be complicated, but if you want to have an impact in this world, your solution needs to be simple, and simple solutions are really hard to build. And this brings us to the next question, is what is big data, correct? And this is something that, again, there's nothing new on big data, correct? So that big data was created, the idea of big data was first named by Doug Laney from Gartner in 2001, where he defined big data as velocity, variety, and volume. And we went from 3 Bs to 4 Bs to 5 Bs to 6 Bs to 7 Bs to 10 Bs. We're actually seeing an exponential growth of the definition of big data that start with the letter B. And I'm not saying they're wrong, but certainly they add to this unnecessary complication and unnecessary complexity. Big data is just data, and the objective is really simple. The power of data is to solve problems with data. That's all that matters. And there's nothing new in solving problems with data. We've been solving problems with data for centuries now. John Snow, back in 1854, and John Snow is not this John Snow, is another John Snow. So back in 1854, using data, whether we call it open or not, I don't know, but we're using data from cholera cases in England. In London, he was able to find that the source of the outbreak, of the cholera outbreak, was a public water pump on the street. So we have been using data for centuries now. If we need to understand why suddenly all the hype, we need to understand what is different now. And of course, it's true, a lot of things are different, correct? It's true that we are generating a huge amount of data, but that's not necessarily the power. The reason why this is so powerful is, the first one is the cost storing data has dramatically gone down. Today, with less than $1,000, you can buy enough storage to store every single book that was written in human history. Something that would have cost you over $1 billion back in 1987, something that would cost less than $100 in a couple of years. On top of this, the cost of storing this data has also dramatically gone down. Today, our Xbox One at home that costs $299 has the same processing power than a supercomputer that NSA bought back in 1999 that cost $67 million and has 6,000 Pentium Pro processors. Today, this device that we use for gaming has the same amount of processing power than that computer. The NVIDIA Titan B cards that are the cards that we are using these days to train deep learning algorithms that cost $3,000 have 3 times the capacity, the processing power, than a supercomputer that the Earth government built back in, that until 2004, this supercomputer was the fastest ever computer ever made in history. And until 2004, this was the fastest computer ever, like in the history of humanity. Nobody has built a supercomputer like this. These computers cost $700 million. Today, with $3,000, you have 3 times the processing power that that computer had. At the end of the day, we have to remember that big data is just data, but the low cost of data collection, storing, and processing create a huge amount of new opportunities. At the end, we still need to understand that we need enough data to solve a problem, but we need to focus on the problem. What is AI? Well, AI is also part of this unnecessary complication, and is also part of marketing. But the mass majority of what is considered, by the way, the definition of AI has been changing over the years. Back in the 70s, ATMs were considered AI. But today, mass majority, not everything, but mass majority of what is considered AI is mainly machine learning and mainly supervised learning. Machine learning algorithms are algorithms basically that can learn to generalize from data, correct? So what we need in order to run these algorithms is really easy. We need what happened in the past, we need the data, and we need a definition of success. That's all we need in order to train a machine learning algorithm. The power here is that before machine learning, what we had was the human knowledge, our human intelligence we would convert this intelligence into logic, and we would put this logic into rules. That is coding, correct? Like this is basically like when you're coding, you are using the human intelligence to create rules that are written as logic rules that are written as a software code, and that is basically how now suddenly these devices are doing what we are telling them to do. Machine learning is different in many ways, because what we're doing is we're automatically learning those rules from the data that we have. This is the power, because in order to solve a problem, all we need is data and a success criteria. Back in the 1990s, mid-1990s, there were a lot of companies that wanted to solve the handwritten character recognition. So if you, for example, if you have a bank or if you have a postal service, you need to be able to automate the process of reading handwritten character and convert that into an actual reading that from a computer, basically. A lot of these companies had hundreds of employees, and some of those companies that solved this problem that cost them years to solve were able to sell those companies in hundreds of billions of dollars. These companies put a huge amount of effort in having the best programmers. You have hundreds of developers solving this problem. And at the end, those that were successful actually sold these companies hundreds of millions of dollars. Today, anybody in this room today, or anybody in the world, can download this data set that is called MNIST, that is kind of the hello world of the open data sets. That is a data set that has these characters that are handwritten characters. And what basically, give me one second, what basically these data set that anybody can download, you can use these 7 lines of code and you can train an algorithm that detect handwritten character recognition. You can train this in less than a second. And suddenly you have a solution to solve the problem that these multiple companies tried to solve back in the 90s. And I can guarantee that this solution will be much better, way better than what these companies did back in the 90s. This shows the power of data. So a lot of people think when we say data is the new oil, data is not the new oil. There's so much difference between oil and data. We should never compare data to oil. Data is the new code. So we need to think that for these AI algorithms, data serves as a purpose of code. This brings us to the problem here. Data and data preparation is 99% of the work. In the case of AI models, 99% of the work, 99% of what we care is data and data preparation. But usually this takes less than 1% of the credit. Majority of the credit goes to the person that goes and train the algorithms and run the algorithms. Majority of the work happens on the data and the data preparation, data collection. All is that the work, but we don't give, we take that for granted, and we don't give enough credit to that. To show an example of this, this is Fei Li, and she was one of the creators of ImageNet. ImageNet is an open data set that has pictures of almost every object out there. So this is millions of pictures of objects. It took years for her to build this. Today, ImageNet was not just the propulsor of the ImageNet competition and the fact that you have teams competing and all the advances in deep learning happen mainly driven by ImageNet. But on top of that, we're using ImageNet as a pre-trained models. The fact that nowadays we can train models with very small amount of data is thanks to the fact that we're using ImageNet as a pre-trained layer. So we are teaching algorithms to see how humans observe objects using ImageNet. The value that ImageNet has provided to the AI community is huge, correct? Unfortunately, even in ImageNet, I still don't think we're giving ImageNet and Fei Li and that whole project enough credit, correct? So we need to give credit where it's due. Majority of the credit goes to people building the AI models or reporting on top of data. As a society, we need to recognize the value of open data and provide the right credits to those that build it. There is a huge amount of power in open data, but part of the problem is we do not give enough credit. There's no incentives to open data sets. Why this is important? For some of the world problems, relying on AI and data, and specifically open data, is the only option we have. Let me show you an example of this. Diabetic retinopathy is the leading cause of vision loss globally. There's 451 million people that suffer from diabetes. And this number has been continuing going up. This is 4 times what it was in the 80s, and it's actually growing much faster than population because of how people change the eating habits. A third of these people will develop diabetic retinopathy if they are not treated. If treated, blindness due to diabetic retinopathy is completely preventable. What's the problem that we have? There's only 200,000 ophthalmologists in the world. There is no physical way for these ophthalmologists to diagnose diabetic retinopathy. Well, today, thanks to open data and thanks to AI, we can actually train diabetic retinopathy models that are on par with very good ophthalmologists. This shows the power of data. This is one of the problems. Diagnosing diabetic retinopathy is a problem that humans cannot solve because we don't have enough doctors. We can use open data set, and you can train models to be on par with ophthalmologists. And again, there's still a lot of room to grow, but majority of the room to grow on this particular problem is getting better open data to solve this problem. And of course, there are private companies that actually have private data, but if we really want the world to everybody in the world to be able to have these models, we need those open data sets. Access to data is one of the biggest challenges we face. And there's a good reason why this happens. There is a significant amount of data that cannot be open to researchers because of privacy. Privacy is a very good reason why we cannot open these data sets. But for the majority of the scenarios, data anonymization just doesn't work. In the early 2000s, we always thought, well, open data will be based on we don't have to worry about privacy. We will just open the data set, like anonymize the data set that is removing some of these PII data points and then call it a day. But that failed miserably. Like, we cannot just think that we will open a data set and just removing the PII will remove the privacy risk. That doesn't work. Especially in the case of medical imaging, it's almost impossible to anonymize that data. The truth is, we don't need the individual's data. All we need is the signal on this data. Differential privacy, this is a technology that was created in Microsoft in the mid-2000s, provides a way for researchers to get insight from the data without affecting the privacy of the individuals, actually providing mathematical guarantees of privacy. And we work with Harvard University and Ferres to create a data differential privacy platform that allows teams to make queries in a privacy compliant way to make sure that the people data there is not affected, but we cannot learn anything from the data that can affect the privacy of an individual. On top of it, we'll continue working on privacy preserving synthetic data. This is basically using the same deep learning algorithms that we use to generate data, we can actually use to generate synthetic data. And what this provides is a way for for teams to create, given a data set, we create synthetic data set. For example, these images that you have here are images that are created by deep learning algorithms. And because of this, we can later on share this data without the risk, a privacy risk for those individuals. And let me show you a few of the examples of the work we have been doing. Like Stefan mentioned, we've been working a lot in SIDS. SIDS is sudden infant death syndrome, and it's the #1 cause of death in developed countries of babies between 1 month to 1 year old. And in the US, 4,000 children die every year of SIDS. SIDS is when your child dies and doctors don't know why. A few years ago, we decided to start trying to help Seattle Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School and the University of Virginia to better understand SIDS using data and using AI. The reason why we were able to do this is because of this amazing open data set that CDC has, that is a period-linked birth infant death data. This is a data set that anybody in the US or anybody in the world can download. It has an agreement that you're not going to go and try to break privacy, but as long as you agree to those terms, you can download and you can use that data set for research. This data set has every single child that was born in the US since the early 80s. And it has a 1-year cohort of those children that die. It's an amazing data set. And we have published now 7 studies, and we continue to work on these. And for example, one of the studies that we published was understanding the impact of every single cigarette, every single cigarette that a mother smokes when they are, during pregnancy, increases the chances of having a child dying of SIDS. And using this data, we were able to understand to the 1 single cigarette per day impact. All of this was possible and was done thanks to the fact that this data set exists. I haven't seen people, like there's a lot of people that use the data set to publish papers every year, and a lot of the findings that we know about babies are thanks to that data set. I don't think that now, I haven't heard anyone giving credit to that data set, I have to say. Like, yeah, there's a notation and there's a citation in the paper, but people don't stop and say, hey, all of this research is thanks to the fact that we have this amazing open data set. As part of AI for Earth, we've been working of mapping solar farms in India. India wishes to achieve 40% cumulative electric power generation capacity from non-fossil fuels by 2030. As part of this effort, the Nature Conservancy Group wanted to understand and wanted to measure this. And thanks to the fact that Sentinel-2, that is an amazing satellite, open, low-resolution satellite data that has a picture of every single point in the Earth every week, we were able to identify these solar farms, and we were able to track them over time. This is an amazing data set that is also free to anybody to use and has pictures of every point on the Earth. Using the same data set, we also did a work in Colombia, working with the Wildlife Conservation Society. All using this open data set, we work with them to create a map of the Orinoquia region. Orinoquia region was a region that before the FARC, when it was affected by the guerrillas and the FARC, now is after the peace agreement in Colombia, they were able to start developing this. And of course, as part of a conservation, they wanted to make sure that they have the maps. So using satellite data, we were able to create these maps and understand all the different ecosystems of all these regions. And this type of map is being used by the Wildlife Conservation Society to work with the government for conservation reasons. Using Landsat, that is another open data set, also satellite data. We are working with Mila in Canada and ICMOD. We were able to, using data, we were able to track the effects of glacial meltings. And this provides an amazing tool for these researchers to understand how these, like what is the health of these glaciers and how are they moving. We continue to work with them now because we want to understand the lakes that are created by these glaciers. This provides an amazing, these open data sets allows all of these research to be done. And again, this is just 4 examples. I cannot tell you how many projects are out there that are based on open data. And I also can tell you that majority of these projects, when people say and celebrate the success of these projects, they do not give enough credit to these open data sets. Jeffrey Hammerbacher, who was one of the first data scientists at Facebook, once said, the best minds of my generation are thinking about how to get people click on ads, and that sucks. And this happened like 10 years ago, and still true today. The best mind of my generation are making sure people click on ads. What the opportunity that provides is the fact that predicting which children have higher chances of dying of SIDS, or predicting which person will have developed cancer, versus predicting which customer will click on an ad, even though these 2 problems cannot be further apart. From a pure data science perspective, from a pure data perspective, from a pure machine learning perspective, these 2 problems are the same problem. So if in your organization you have people that are good, pretty good at making sure people click on their ads, you can use the same knowledge to solve more important problems. There's 6.4 million children worldwide die before the 5 years of age, 1 billion children worldwide living in poverty, 2.1 billion people lack access to safely managed drinking water services. In our smartphones today, we have more processing power than the one that was needed to put a man on the moon. There are very important problems out there that can and should be solved with data, and can and should be solved with open data. We no longer have excuses. We need to go and help. Thank you very much. I'll take your questions now.
Thanks so much, Juan, for this very inspirational and a call for recognition for those that share data in an equal fashion as those that are actually leveraging the insight from the data and quite often get recognized. And indeed, I think there are not that many initiatives even that do this kind of naming and faming for those that do sharing. The only one I'm aware of is the Symbiont awards that you might know as well, Juan, which is really about open research data sharing. That actually has a program, but it's very limited to actually celebrate the ones that are sharing data. But we do need to, indeed change the paradigm here and celebrate those behind open data, because quite often in the past, I did a lot of work, and quite often I always said, I don't know anyone who got promoted because they shared data, right? And especially within large organizations, it's actually quite often the opposite, which goes back to one of the questions that was posed in the Q&A by Kate Wing, which is whether you have good examples of making training data sets open and auditable when used for public purposes. And especially many companies keep not only the algorithms, but also the training data private, right? So there's not an incentive quite often even, and again, would be interesting to hear your experience within a private sector context. What's the incentive and how do we celebrate if within a company, right? Because quite often it's risky to even share some of the data for training data purposes. Over to you.
Yeah, so let me tell you one thing. I think, like I mentioned, I'm very passionate about the fact that we don't give recognition. And again, like, have to be clear here. Not even my team, we're not perfect in that regard either. Like we try to remember ourselves, but it's part of it's something that we need to unlearn. We need to learn how to give credit to these organizations. We need to create the right incentives. Today, when, like you mentioned, when we explore the amount of open data sets out there, majority of them at least started like a completely philanthropic effort. There was no upside for these people, and that's why, like, we have to even give more credit to this organization, because they did it out of nothing. And not only out of nothing, there's a lot of times they actually have put themselves into a risk. Like some of the early, if you remember the AOL fiasco, correct? So what happened in, I think it was 2006, like the CTO of AOL saying, I want to help society, I'm going to open data sets of all search queries because people can use that. There was no upside for them. And they also did not a great job removing the privacy, and those people that end up in the New York Times for the wrong reasons. And the guy lost his job, basically, correct? so today, not only we don't have incentives, we have negative incentives. There's actually, like, why would I ever open a data set if I can lose my job, basically, correct? And if you're a researcher, it's even worse, correct? Like, why would I, like, if I open a data set, my data set, the one that I use to publish my paper, and then suddenly other people can actually find more things, can find problems in my paper. It's like, I also have negatives, even if I'm a researcher. So I do think as a society, we need to help create incentives, even by forcing the incentives. For example, if I'm a government and I'm giving funds to research, once that research is published, there should be good reasons that people should open those data sets. Like, there's majority of the value, I can say that from my experience, a lot of the value in the research come from opening data sets, basically. So we definitely need to create the incentives. In the private sector, that's a great question. It's like, I don't know how we could create some of those incentives, but we need to find ways to create those incentives. Everything is about incentives, and I don't have a solution for that. I have a really good reflection of the problem. I'm not sure I have a solution for that. But certainly we need to have, as a society, we need to work together. First, to recognize there's a lot of value in open data sets, but second, how do we create the incentives? Even by forcing the incentives, or by being intelligent and creating the incentives. Basically. We don't have those incentives today. We have negative incentives.
Right. Thanks. And of course, anyway, one reason why we call it the state of open data policy is also to think about how can policy incentivize some of the sharing environment as well. And I think that's also one of the discussions that we had earlier on as well. And we will, of course, have a broader conversation about access to private sector data in the next panel. But there is one more question for you, Juan, because I'm sensitive to your time and you already have given us great insights here. And the question is not only about incentives, but also about costs. And quite often, again, there's a lot of discussion about open data as if there is no cost involved with regard to making data even accessible. And so whether you have a view on dealing with costs as it relates to making data accessible, and whether there should be, anyway, dedicated kind of ways to cover that moving forward as well.
When we say cost, I think I would say the different type of costs. So the one cost that was the historical cost is the cost of storage, and that continues to go down, correct? Like I mentioned in the presentation, the cost of storage today, unless you're thinking about something like satellite data, that has a huge amount of cost because it's of the size. Majority of the problems that we have today, the cost of storing data is usually not the issue. The issue, there's a say that data scientists spend 80% of the time wrangling with data and 20% of the time complaining about wrangling with data, correct? That's 100% of what data scientists do. The majority of the cost is on wrangling with data, like working with data. And majority of that cost come from the fact that the data is noisy. The data was wrongly created. There's like no standards. Majority of the problems come from the data collection aspect, basically, correct? A lot of the data is collected by other reasons. And I think as a lesson is when we collect data, we usually are thinking of the problem that I'm trying to solve. For example, let me give you a great example of this, is that an amazing data set that has been used now for COVID and for many other problems is when someone goes to a hospital, they need to pay for a procedure, correct? That goes into a data set. And that is likely one of the only data sets, at least in the US, that has a normalized way of all the transactions that happen in hospitals, correct? So it's an amazing data set. But the data set was created to charge people. It wasn't created for researchers to understand whether COVID has any more problems here or there. Now it's being used for that. And it's an amazing data set to do that. But because it wasn't created for that, a lot of times, well, for example, the ICD-10 codes are the codes that we use to say whether this is like COVID or this is something else. If the person types something else, you will still get the bill. But from a research perspective, now you will have a lot of noise in that data. So I think the lesson, huge lesson there, is all of the majority of the runs data and the cost happens because of the data collection. So when we start collecting data, we need to do our best job to try to think that even if you're solving one particular problem, that data might be used for other purposes. So let's spend some more time creating those procedures, creating those protocols, using standards as much as we can. The fact that even in COVID, you have we have metrics that basically have the same name. For example, I don't know, like the test positivity rate, correct? That's a very important metric for tracking COVID. Every single state, not every single state, but you have at least six different variations of how that metric was calculated, how one metric was collected, even within the US, correct? So invest in standards and invest in respecting standards, basically. So
great. Thanks so much, Juan, and I believe we run out of time here, unless you want to answer some of the remaining questions, which some of them are more statements than.
More than happy to answer. I have some more time. Like I was looking at I was just reading the text. I don't know if there's questions here.
Well, there are a few questions by, I think one question, and again, we do have another panel as well. So I think
sorry.
One more question, which was by Oliver, which was a clarification, and then Tricia had a few as well. But Oliver basically asked the question whether you could clarify your remark with regard to the to what extent is solving SIDS the same as solving the problem of having people click on ads, and what makes you make that statement that this is the similar kind of data problem? That's a longer conversation, but that's
that's a great question. It's like from a pure data perspective, and again, we're not solving SIDS, but we are basically trying to understand whether a family will have higher chances of SIDS, correct? From a pure machine learning and data science perspective, this problem is the same problem as finding people that will click on the ads. The data is very different, but the problem from a pure data scientist perspective, the problem is the same problem, and that's why. When you look at the work that my team has been doing, we're working with pancreatic cancer, we're working with seeds, we're working with solar panels, we're working at identifying giraffes in Africa. It's like all of these problems are really different. We know very little about these things. We need to partner with subject matter experts, but from a pure data perspective, the problems are very similar. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that if you, in your organization, you have people that are really good to make sure that people click on your ads, you can use that same knowledge to go solve other problems. That's the point that I'm trying to make, basically.
Thanks so much, Juan. And it shows also the potential of actually, anyway, reuse of expertise, not only reuse of data, and even reuse of some of the models. Thanks so much, Juan. This was super interesting and super inspiring as always, and really appreciate your leadership here with regard to the opening data, and again, the call for coming up with incentives, and more incentives in part as recognition, but also other incentives as it relates to open data, which will be indeed, I agree with you, a big wave to actually making data more open, if those that make data open are recognized and also actually benefit from their efforts as well. Thanks so much, Juan. And over to the next panel, which actually will focus on a lot of the issues that were also raised in the chat, which are around incentives for actually the private sector to open up some of their data, or at least make their data accessible, or in certain cases, make the insights of their data accessible to a broader audience as well. And I'm delighted that this time you won't be burdened with me moderating, because as you can see, I do a bad job in even keeping the time, but you will have Andrew Young, who is our knowledge director, take the lead here in moderating the next panel. Thanks, and over to you, Andrew.
Great, thanks so much, Stefan. And that is indeed me on the far right of the slide, whether you can tell or not. And exactly, I think Juan's remarks and insights provided a really fantastic bridge to this, our second panel and our concluding session for today's summit, which exactly focuses on institutionalizing opening data in the private sector with a particular focus on policy options and some emerging innovative practices. And through our work in the Open Data Policy Lab over the years, we've seen evidence of substantial interest in the private sector and across the private sector for expanding access to the data they hold, both to benefit society and to create new types of business value. It's increasingly evident that while governments collect and hold large amounts of useful data globally, much of the data that could actually support public interest objectives are in fact held in the private sector. And despite the clear opportunity and growing interest, businesses and leaders in the private sector are often reluctant to establish open data programs thanks to the current amorphous policy environment, a lack of high-level support within their organizations, and concerns about various types of risks around privacy and other issues, just to name a few barriers to action. And this panel, we're really going to focus on how to address those barriers and create policies institutionally and more generally that can enable and incentivize data stewardship and openness within the private sector. And we're really going to seek to understand what companies, startups, and others can do to support an open data ecosystem that fosters the creation of business value while centering the public's data rights and interests. And of course, we'll solve all of this over the next 55 minutes or so. Recognizing that we're running a bit short or a bit late on time, without any further ado, I want to jump in and introduce our fantastic high-level panel here, comprising leaders and experts from across the private sector who are currently navigating this policy environment and seeking to create value through new forms of responsible data stewardship. So first, I'm delighted to introduce Iona Stoinescu, who's been coordinating the government affairs activities of Roche Romania as government affairs manager since 2017, working closely with industry associations and other partners from the public and private sector to facilitate patients' access to the latest medical innovations. Next, we have Fiona Gregg, who's a managing director and co-president at the JP Morgan Chase Institute, which delivers data-rich analyses and expert insights for the public good. She joined the Institute in 2014 after serving as the deputy budget director for the city of Philadelphia, as a consultant for McKinsey, and the founder of Bank DC, a financial inclusion program for the District of Columbia. Thanks so much for being here, Fiona. Then we have Caroline Luveau, the Chief Privacy Officer for MasterCard. She's leading the global team responsible for ensuring that privacy and data protection are addressed in all business processes that collect, use, or disclose personally identifiable information about cardholders, customers, partners, and employees. And she's driving and creating strategy across MasterCard's global privacy program around a number of different initiatives. So thanks so much for being here, Caroline. And then finally, last but not least, we have Brennan Lake, who's the Vice President of Social Impact at Spectus AI, where he's responsible for driving positive social impact through the novel and responsible use of mobility data. Brennan also serves on the World Bank Strategic Advisory Group on development data partnerships and as a board member of the Technology Exchange Lab, where he previously served as co-director. So thanks so much to all of you for joining us. We clearly have a really impressive panel here with a lot of wisdom and experience to share. I could have easily filled a lot more of our time listing everyone's various affiliations and accolades. But without any further ado, why don't we go ahead and jump into the discussion. So the first question is to you, Iona, which is really around your work in the healthcare industry, which has a long history of collaborations with researchers and universities that have led to improvements in how we treat disease through secondary use of data. We've already discussed some of those in some of the previous sessions. Really interested in hearing from you, what do you see as some of the enablers of that coordination and collaboration between the healthcare industry and some of those external researchers, universities, and other actors? And how would you kind of describe the current state of play as it relates to the policies and actions that are enabling that type of work? And are there any notable policies, practices, or other incentives that you see as particularly applicable or relevant to companies in the healthcare sector, or potentially others as well? So as usual, a short and simple set of questions over to you, Iona. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. Actually, it was all of them very, very good questions, challenging and really, really good after following Juan's, let's say, introduction on healthcare topics. I saw a lot of very good examples on how data in healthcare was used, and really provided a very good starting point for discussion. I would say that the secondaries of health data firstly enables a wide range of benefits across the entire healthcare system. And these include opportunities to optimize services, to reduce healthcare inequalities, better allocating resources, and or actually to use it to help enhance personalized healthcare. And an example could be just comparing treatments for people with similar characteristics. So the secondary use of health data can help innovation by enhancing research data and to assess whether the new therapies would work for a broader population. And let's say if we think about the potential economic benefits of the secondary use of health data, the recent publication of European health data space, the regulation, just mentioned several key figures, like for example, the health data reuse is estimated to be worth around 25 or 30 billion euros annually. If we think about primary use of health data, patients as healthcare can see a benefit of approximately 1.4 billion. And I also want to mention one more figure that I was capturing in my mind about the secondary use of health data, where there could be an estimation of the benefits of around 3.4 billion euro. So I think that's really a good overview of what that means. And I would say that with the aging population, an increase in chronic illness, health impact on climate change that we see so recently mentioned, reduced and certainly the reduced available government spending in the this area of pandemic, there is a clear and really urgent need to increase the efficiency in the healthcare systems. And applying data insights can help optimize the allocation of healthcare spending. Of course, facilitate a more preventive, maybe based model, encourage and enable a safe management of chronic illness, and for sure, maybe ensure also a fair prioritization of health resources for in the directions that are of greatest health burden. Of course, the state. If we discuss about the current state of play, it's actually the healthcare sector is among the last industry to pursue maybe the use of secondary data. And only if we think about how tech company already use the data to refine their marketing, as we discussed previously, programs, or how easy we share our data for transport or ordering food, among others, it makes us wonder why pharma sector is moving so slowly. But this is because healthcare data is far more complex and also very sensitive topic. And in today's era of personalized medicine, we are moving towards a more exhaustive, holistic view of patient health generated from a wide variety of health data sources. So the quantity of data actually is huge, and this requires especially for healthcare, a new ecosystem of partnership with healthcare and technology companies to be able to analyze it and actually extract value. The ecosystem of data, it's also requiring a lot of an integrated level of coordination. Of course, it was mentioned before, standardization, analysis, and all of which we rely actually on this kind of really collaboration establishments of healthcare companies and technology partners. Just maybe thinking about the data in healthcare, and there are already a lot of sets of data streaming from many sources in vivo diagnostics, lifestyles, sensors, labs, electronic records, genomic data. Physicians and patients themselves are actually providing data. So together, all these data can drive better decision making and find the most effective treatments for specific patients. let's say in the sense, I need to mention again, maybe to reinforce the message that no one can bring this vision of integration and analysis and this critical, I would say, component of achieving and improving patient care unless we do this collective effort in public and also in private sector, and the partnership to support innovation in the medical sectors. And if we speak about the incentives, policies, and practices, your third question, I think it was, I would say that there are a few key principles. The first principle or challenge would be that use of data and related policies should anticipate the needs of the people. Sounds maybe obvious that, but currently the infrastructure, process, and the indicators are fragmented and focused on organization and administration and financing of healthcare. Second principle I have to mention is that data policies should, maybe after the first principle, support and enable a personal centered process of information exchange and interaction. And not the last one, the third one, we need to measure and collect these outcomes and as a result of the process. So the implication of policymakers and that they should really develop policies and related actions which support this integration of data along the person-centered care process. Also, it's important to think from a functional perspective. What do we need from data to support people, professionals, rather than only thinking about from a technical or legal perspective, because this was clearly a very much focus. And it's not only better access to data and its responsible usage, but it's also data must be secured. We heard also in the first panel this aspect that high quality, interoperable, and in order to that the ecosystem actors can drive like meaningful use from the data and to inform better decision across sectors, and of course in healthcare. And as regards investment, regardless the sector, I think building capabilities to empower individuals and investing in skills and in general this data literacy shall be the focus. Key actions shall focus on maybe working to establish a common shared vocabulary. I heard earlier Stefan mentioned about this vocabulary specific to data, which will enable a shared understanding in this data space. This will help all partners interact more effectively, navigate this complex data ecosystem, and individuals to build a data literacy, which in turn will help build the trust in data overall. So it's critical to educate individuals on both the risk and value of data sharing. And of course, when it's appropriate to share their data and when it's know their privacy rights, and that we need to ensure that the system or the ecosystem is strong and trusted. So I think that's in short somehow the answers to your questions. Hope I covered well.
No, you covered them all fantastic, and that's a really rich response that we could dive into on all kinds of different issues. But why don't we pause now and move to Fiona, and then we'll resurface some of these issues going forward. But Fiona, I'm eager to get your thoughts here on, given the JP Morgan Chase Institute's work and the ways in which the Institute is finding ways to reuse data on labor and financial market conditions to help different stakeholders across sectors make more informed decisions. I'm eager to get your sense of what the business case is behind the Institute, and relatedly, whether there are any particular policies that you see as currently lacking or missing in the space that, if they were in existence, it would actually enable the Institute and other similar actors based in the private sector to actually do more to create that kind of institutional and business value from the data that they hold.
Yeah, great questions, Andrew, and thanks for having me here. So I'll tell the story of the creation of the Institute, this was really Jamie Dimon's idea back in 2014, that I think he had come out of the financial crisis realizing just how big the decisions that were being taken by policymakers during the financial crisis with almost no contemporaneous data, right? So huge decisions about, you know, should we write people's mortgages down? Should we write the principal of those mortgages down, or should we give people payment relief? Like that is a basic question to solve this financial crisis, which is really born out of the housing market in that circumstance. So he had the wisdom, I think, to realize that JP Morgan was sitting on this, you know, Mount Everest of data that, had it been accessible or useful during the financial crisis, could have informed some of those big policy questions and, you know, many other evergreen questions that, you know, we wrestle with. And so the Institute was created to, you know, use the firm's administrative data for to do economic research for the public good. And so we think of our stakeholders as policymakers, but also, you know, business leaders, anyone who's trying to sort of make decisions. And over the years, you know, we've tried to answer questions that were top of mind for those stakeholders, like what are the big policy questions we're wrestling with? Like, for example, what are the causes of inflation right now? And to which of these questions do our data offer a distinctive perspective? And because not always the case. I mean, the inflation, actually, that's a tricky one, right? We see lots of spending data, but spending is price times quantity, right? And so it's not clear to me that we have a good lens into the inflation question, as an example. So I think the experience of the pandemic, though, in many ways sort of proved the business case. We, alongside many other private sector entities, ADP, LinkedIn, you know, you name it, kinds of different data. And there's a wonderful chapter summarized by Brookings on all of the new private sector data sources that came to the fore during the pandemic and were really important sources of a contemporaneous real-time view of what on earth is going on in the economy, what is the impact of the various different interventions that are being taken, should they be repeated or extended or continued on an ongoing basis. And I'll give two examples of what we did. One, very simple, was, you know, people's income was changing, people's spending was changing. So we started tracking cash balances in people's checking accounts, because that's sort of like where all of these things net out, right? And that turned out to be a very useful sort of way to just summarize, well, how is the typical family faring? And importantly, by income quartile. And so we published that chart, and we've published it and you know, updates to it on an ongoing basis. The second example is just, you know, during COVID, we offered, the government expanded unemployment insurance in historic ways. And of course, there were big debates about what the impacts were on spending, but also on people's work disincentives or whether they were going back to work. And so we published throughout the pandemic a whole bunch of work just trying to understand, okay, what is the impact of these expanded UI benefits on people's spending, on their work, participation, et cetera. So now you asked me what are some of the incentives, you know, what are some of the things that would make this possible for us to do on a broader scale? I think it's fair to, you know, for context, we have a team of roughly 30 or so economists and data scientists, including a couple of external partners, academics who access these data. And I would say, you know, in terms of the business case, I think the business case isn't just to be a data provider, it is to be an insight provider, right? So from a strategic standpoint, we didn't necessarily just want to put the data out there and sort of let it be used by others. We wanted to be part of the insight creation process. And so that's the sense. And for that reason, you know, we've done these collaborations with academics, but we've remained intact, you know, partners in those teams, in those academic teams. But secondly, you know, these are private. These are, you know, 70 million consumers. These are their transactions, their balances, their income, their spending. And if it's not the icky factor of my financial life being made available to others, even in a de-identified way, I think it's right that you know, de-identification is sort of a spectrum, right? And it's hard to get from all the way from 0 to 1 in terms of like really being de-identified. And so there's always the risk of re-identification. And so whether it's the icky factor of like, I don't want my consumer data or my available on, to the public. There's also, just the client, and market related data, like, you could use these data to see, what were sales at Amazon like, and you could do so prior to earnings, like prior to public releases. And so you could there is a sort of materiality to some of these data and how they could be used in terms of understanding, how publicly traded companies are doing. So, those are sort of two. The other thing I would say is that, well, then why haven't we expanded? If we have half a dozen or a dozen or so people that external collaborators that we've worked with, why can't we just make that, 100, with a data use agreement and all kinds of controls over that. And I would say even there, an academic paper takes at least 4 years to write, right? From like idea to publication. And in that time frame, like our tech stack turns over, right? So the time that they get the revise and resubmit on that paper, they have to sort of refactor their code in a new language and the data is in a new environment. And so, I think it makes it tricky to the fixed costs associated with any one of those partners, any one of those projects is large. It's hard to do this in a lightweight way, to collaborate in a lightweight way.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Fiona. Really useful insights here. And again, we could go in all kinds of different directions, but why don't we finish our kind of tour de table here, and then we'll move into more of a discussion. So now I'm eager to hand the floor over to Caroline. So thinking about some of what Fiona just touched on, the recognition that data does have the potential to create substantial societal insights and value, but obviously there are still risks and challenges associated with data stewardship and reuse, as well as a level of concern that is probably related to, but not limited to, the icky factor that Fiona just mentioned, which is clearly a part of the equation. I'm eager to get your thoughts, Caroline, on what you see as the sources of anxiety among private sector actors around entering into more of this data stewardship, data reuse, open data type of model, and how have you and your team at MasterCard been proactive in navigating and addressing these anxieties and issues, and whether there are any particular types of policies that you see as particularly beneficial in navigating those issues or building trust in different ways.
Thank you, Andrew. Again, actually, a lot of different questions in your questions. So let me first say and repeat what we've heard actually this today. Obviously, data has huge potential to solve some of the most pressing societal challenges. And MasterCard has a long history actually to leverage our data to create insights for social impact. And so, for example, we work with cities to help them in many different ways, with urban planning, with how to respond to a natural disaster like a hurricane. During COVID, and to Fiona's point, we have also created recovery insights based on aggregated anonymized data to help governments, merchants, banks understand what was happening to them and minimize the impact of the pandemic and plan then for the economic recovery. But then to your point, open data and data reuse can also create some risks and anxiety. For example, how do we make sure that data is fully protected end to end with the highest security measures? How do we make sure that you know and you control how your data is being reused? So very simple questions, but getting it right is extremely complicated. So let me maybe share 3 ways as to how MasterCard is addressing these challenges. So first, we have established data responsibility principles that guide all our data practices across the company. These principles are super easy to understand so that you don't have to be an expert. When it comes to your data, you own it, you control it, you should benefit from its use, and will protect it. So very simple principles, and very important to instill a culture of privacy and data responsibility across the company. And so in practice, we design all our solutions with those principles in mind to really put the individual at the center. And I loved, I think, Jonas' point about, hey, let's actually not forget that this is about people and not about legal, technology, etc. And so it's really a top-down and bottom-up approach at Mastercard. And then the second thing that we do is we invest in technology, because still you need technology to really enhance security and privacy across the whole ecosystem. And so to give a couple of examples, we are tokenizing card numbers to make sure that your card number is not going to be visible or accessible by merchants or by any third parties. We've also pioneered anonymization solutions to enable these data analytics in a fully privacy compliant way. We're investing in privacy enhancing technologies. And I heard a lot actually from Juan in that respect: homomorphic encryption, synthetic data, multi-party computation. All these technologies enable data to be shared, to be analyzed, so that we can extract the value from all that data, but actually in a way that is fully privacy preserving. And then last, but not least, we are also investing in governance to really set standards for the whole payment ecosystem. So Mastercard is a founding member, for example, of EMVCO that sets security and data standards for the whole industry. And we have a really strong franchise model to make sure that these standards are being followed by everyone. Now, obviously, there are a couple of things that actually I think we could do better. I mean, actually, at the policy level. And I'm going to share two thoughts in that respect. First, today we face really a patchwork of law, and we've heard about privacy. We face a patchwork of laws and regulations in this area that introduce highly complex and fragmented standards all around the globe. And even worse, we are facing increasing restrictions to transfer data across borders. Well, this is not sustainable. You know, data has no frontier. Data is kind of global. So it's really time to reopen the dialogue in this respect to develop common standards on privacy, data, and technology. And there are many, many initiatives out there, and we are seeing some progress, so there's hope. You know, there are initiatives within the OECD, G7, G20, ASEAN countries. I think it's really time to make this a top priority. And then the second thought that I wanted to put on the table is that if you want to build trust in the open data ecosystem, obviously we need to invest in technology, but also in certifications, trust marks, and seals. You know, like the organic trust mark in the food industry, this could really help build trust for people and for businesses. And so concretely, companies could be incentivized, and I heard about incentives. Companies could be incentivized to go the extra mile and to seek that certification. They may only want to, you know, select partners that have that certification. Investors could also take that into account when they make investment decisions. And then people, because it's all about people, right? People could use that actually to make informed choices about who they want to trust and who they want to share the data with. I think actually it might also help build trust in that open data ecosystem.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Caroline. It's a really valuable set of reflections there, and I think a useful call to action in a lot of ways as well. So now I'm happy to go last but not least to Brennan. And Brennan, at Spectus and formerly Cubic, you've been leading all types of cross-sector data collaborations through the Data for Good program, around all types of different objectives and purpose areas with a number of different types of partners. I'm eager to get your thoughts on what you see as really guiding and enabling these partnerships and relationships with different actors across sectors around your mobility data work, and whether there are any particular policy models, principles, or other good practices that others might be able to follow, whether in the mobility space or in other domains.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew, and to the other panelists and Stefan and everyone for the conference. I actually think that in thinking about the policies and models that have guided us in building our social impact program, it's actually kind of helpful to segment it into kind of two phases of our organization's development, because the social impact program has been around for about 5 years. And also to frame it in these two topics that have been emerging, which is one is how do we mitigate risks and what are the policies we put in place to do that? But also how can we identify incentives to justify the existence of this program internally to our board of directors, and how can we use some of those frameworks to help inspire other private sector companies to launch their own data for good or social impact programs. So since Spectus is a little less known than MasterCard, Roche, and JP Morgan, I'll give a very quick introduction on what we do. So in short, Spectus is a privacy-first geospatial data platform. And through our Data for Good / social impact program, we create data collaboratives with universities, NGOs, and multilaterals to support analyses related to human mobility data. So these are often actually quite similar to the initiatives at MasterCard, focus on urban development, disaster response, and public health as well. So when we were getting started, we knew that as table stakes, we had to have in place certain governance policies and mechanisms, and then technical interventions to preserve privacy. So on the governance side, it's interesting, a lot of this actually jibes really well with university IRBs or ethical review boards, and we work mostly with universities, so it's quite harmonious. But essentially in terms of the governance mechanisms, first, all data is collected with absolute informed consent. So rather than having stuff buried in terms and conditions, people very upfront agree to have, their data shared in a certain way, but also for specific named purposes, including research. So whether this is actually reuse or principal use, I think is arguable because people are actually opting in for their data to be used for research. We also make sure that we have a very strict limit of scope of the project, so that if we have a researcher who says, I want to analyze access to green spaces among low-income communities in Manhattan, then we will structure that into our agreement. But then if they say we also want to do epidemiological research, we have to have a joint discussion, run it by our chief privacy officer and privacy counsel to make sure that it fits within our own policies and there are no privacy implications of that types of research. At the same time, we very explicitly lay out what cannot be done with our data, things like law enforcement, looking at vulnerable communities, or also just making sure that people aren't looking at things like social demonstrations or protests. We also make sure that we have time bounds in our agreement so that users only get access to our platform and data for a limited period of time. And this also helps kind of push them towards creating outputs, towards creating public goods that can be enjoyed by everyone. And then on the technical side, a lot of this has already been mentioned several times. So on one hand, we implement true differential privacy to the aggregation process. And coincidentally, we learned how to implement differential privacy in a very simple way by actually participating in Microsoft's Smart Noise program, which Juan had showed during his keynote. So anyone interested in differential privacy, highly encourage looking at the Microsoft Smart Noise early adopter program. But then beyond that, we also only allow access to our data through what we call a data clean room, which is kind of analogous to multi-party computation, but not quite there technically. So that users can log into our platform, submit queries to our data, and they only get aggregate results in return. So those are some of like the governance and technical policies that we had to put in place really as table stakes to engage in responsible data stewardship. But now we're at a point where demand for our data has really skyrocketed, during the pandemic and onwards. And so we have to be more intentional about selecting projects that really amplify as much impact as possible, but we also need to think about shared value. And by shared value, I mean value that is created not only for society, but for the company as well. And I think that there's a really fantastic argument for this, because if a social impact program can generate value for the corporation that's sponsoring it, it is likely to survive. It is likely to go the long run, to go through IPOs, M&As, or whatever it may be. So in order to identify how we were creating value for our company, we developed a framework called the 4M framework, which identifies 4 key drivers to value creation. And incidentally, it's very similar to the GovLab's 9R framework as well, which I think you can find on Medium. But essentially, the 4M framework identifies 4 key drivers of value creation. And that's mission, methods, messaging, and monetization. So for mission, we want to make sure that our projects are creating measurable social impact. And by doing this, we also get a benefit of being a purpose-driven organization that people like working for. So it can help with recruiting efforts and our relationships with all different types of stakeholders. In terms of methods, we really want to see researchers who are developing innovative geospatial algorithms and methods that can then be open sourced for the whole geospatial data community. And that also benefits our companies because it provides our users more advanced tools to process data. Messaging is a nice to have. Essentially, when you work on all of these really cool projects, you can tell a great story, engage in data journalism, which can also help generate things like leads for private companies, which is quite attractive. And then monetization is kind of this positive externality that happens by virtue of having all of these very public use cases. When you publish, one of your partners publishes a journal that talks about your data in very transparent terms, the good, the caveats, the limitations, commercial companies who see those papers love actually getting a very clear, independent, third-party picture of what the data looks like without relying on us, so that even if there are caveats around the data, they can feel more confident about making a procurement decision, which kind of de-risks the process and just can help gain more clients. So anytime a project comes across our desk, we score it based on these 4 M's, which with mission and method scored a little bit more heavily. And it allows us to both introduce fairness and make sure we're being intentional about creating value. And then finally, some external policies that have really inspired us. Something that's inspired me specifically for the past couple of years is I read a piece by Robert Kirkpatrick from UN Global Pulse, and he talked about the dichotomy between the misuse of data, which we talk about a lot, and then misuse of data, which we don't talk about as much. And by misuse, he's talking about that opportunity cost of doing nothing, right? If data can solve an issue, but you're not using it, that's a huge opportunity cost. It's not a crime, but it's really too bad, right? And so I think blending that with concepts like the GovLab social license, this principle that you can assemble a group of citizens to determine what data should and shouldn't be used for and listen to them, that's really attractive from a private sector perspective, because then we can move beyond self-regulation because there's no meaningful regulation in this space, and look towards what people are saying, what the Assembly of Citizens are saying, and what social licenses they've given us to actually pursue those use cases. I don't know if there's the possibility also, finally, just to create some kind of safe harbor provisions that if a data provider is acting in good faith, meeting the technical standards that have been defined by another body for a specific use case, could there be a safe harbor that would protect them from backlash, right? I think that could be a really interesting topic to explore as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Brendan. A lot of really interesting points to put on the table here. As usual, there's all kinds of different directions that we could go, but I want to be responsive to the attendees who have submitted a few questions here. So now that everyone's had a chance to navigate a flurry of questions on different topics, looking at our Q&A here, I see a few questions that I want to put to the group here, and whoever wants to chime in with a first thought, happy to hear it. First, from Josh. Josh raises the recent news around some geolocation data being accessible around things like abortion clinics in the States, where there's obviously a lot of contention at the moment, to say the least. And I think the real nut of this question is, how can data stewards and data providers, especially in the public sector, kind of anticipate and proactively mitigate some of these issues that might be emerging over time? So obviously something like abortion is always a contentious issue, but the events of the last few weeks have really shone a light on that issue quite a bit. How can data stewards proactively mitigate some of these issues? Because obviously there are all kinds of different challenges that might emerge once data is out there in the real world. And Brandon, I see your hand.
Yeah, I thought I would just jump on this because this is, of course, a story about mobility data, which is what we work with. for, I believe, at least 2 years ago, perhaps even a little bit more, our company put out a sensitive point of interest policy that's both a governance and a technical mechanism. So basically, we maintain a list of approved or whitelisted points of interest where you can do human mobility, like visitation analyses, and then blacklisted sensitive POIs that are not permitted. From a technical, so governance perspective, do this, don't do that, right? From a technical perspective, we actually maintain a sensitive point of interest database so that whenever a point is within a certain distance of that location, it's completely deleted, right? You completely delete it from the data set so that, things like sexual reproductive centers would just be removed from the data set. We've been pushing self-regulation like industries to adopt this. I believe that an advertising industry will adopt it soon. But I think this is another one of those things that if we can get feedback about social license and show, clearly this is not an acceptable use case, it would be much more easy to justify actions, because right now we're just policing ourselves. I think this is something that there should be a universal policy on not looking at visitation at sensitive POIs.
Thanks so much for that, Brennan. Any other thoughts from the panelists? What, not necessarily on this particular case, but what it speaks to, which is emerging challenges and sensitivities that, especially with a somewhat one-size-fits-all approach to data sharing, let's say, some of those sensitivities might not be meaningfully addressed. Any other thoughts on how to proactively, through policy or other interventions, kind of mitigate any of those risks? Brennan, I think you covered it. So why don't we jump to the second question, which is from Hector, which is an interesting one around what Hector sees as one of the big challenges is the lack of certified data auditing services in the space, and the lack of certifications and certifiers specifically. And Hector is wondering if any of the folks on the panel here have any thoughts on looking at making data audits public in some way to provide some of that transparency and insight, and doing so while protecting intellectual property, trade and business secrets, and other obvious business considerations. So, any thoughts on that front?
I'm happy to certainly, I think the idea of an external audit is interesting. We have an internal audit process, right, where we internally audit ourselves, or we are being audited to assess whether we are adhering to all of the privacy and controls and et cetera, that relate to all of the data, the technology that are used and the production of the insights from data. So certainly there's a notion within our firm that these kinds of processes need to be audited. Whether that should also exist as an external data audit, I think is also, is an interesting question. In some sense, I guess I want to level set in terms of sort of the burden of proof, and also the contribution that these data are making relative to, say, the counterfactual. So, I'll give you an example. Right now, there's a big debate about student loan debt, whether it should be canceled, how we should reform payment, plans, et cetera. And yet the federal government has in its power all of the data it would need to know exactly how to target, reform, et cetera, right? You have income data in the IRS, you have loan data in the Department of Ed. These data sets don't talk to one another. So you cannot know what is the current income level of student loan borrowers. Now, this is something we see in our data, right? We have credit bureau records that tell us the loan balances, we see income out of people's checking accounts. And so we're kind of trying to publish this as a way to inform this debate about how would you, right? So in some sense, I'm kind of, I feel like the private sector is coming into play because the public sector is decades behind, or perhaps needs to figure out a way to get out of its own way of sharing data across these agencies that is central to informing public policy. yeah, so I mean, anyway, that's just that's an example of like why the private sector data can be helpful, is because the public sector data are woefully inadequate to answer the question.
I'm happy to give another color. So while I think actually that to be honest, I think we need actually data auditors. Let me actually first say that. And today, Mastercard has obviously a very robust audit team, and I have created within my team a compliance assurance program, so that actually we do our own basically checks and audits to make sure that we remain in compliance with all the requirements. But this is hard, right? Because first of all, the requirements keep changing. I mean, these laws are just evolving so fast. I think it's hard actually for auditors to keep up. And very often actually when we deal with auditors, we spend our time to train them about these topics. So I think that's one of the reasons why they're a bit behind. Now, imagine that actually they would be there. Would it be really, really useful for people to see the audits reports? That gives me pause. You know, our privacy notices that don't really help people. So that's actually coming back to my earlier point. Wouldn't it be actually more useful for people to have a stamp from a certified, you know, a third-party accountability agents, like in the APEC program, or a regulator, or any certified body? Hey, that company meets the standards, but without actually people having to go to the results of an audit, which I think might actually go a bit too much into the weeds. But I do agree, we need actually audit programs in place for sure, internal and external.
Fantastic. Really, really helpful thoughts, Caroline and Fiona. We're running short on time, and I want to make sure that we end on time here. So I do want to pose one, unless there are any burning questions from the attendees. I'm eager to quickly go around the panel here and get one final reflection from each of you, and one last opportunity to tap into your wisdom and experience here, and really thinking about, you know, as a brief kind of final thought, in your view, what is the one policy intervention that could be implemented today if we had the right mobilization of the right decision makers, that if that policy were implemented, it would enable the private sector to open and steward data in a more useful and societally beneficial way, and generally kind of accelerate a transition toward a more sustainable, responsible, systematic type of data reuse ecosystem, especially as it relates to private sector data holders. So what is that, to use Stefan's phrase, the magic wand, what is that one policy intervention that you think would be most immediately impactful? And I'm happy to go back to where we started, which is over to you, Iona.
Thank you. Yes, one. Well, just one. It's too it's too limited. But yeah, maybe just to think what would be the one. I would choose I would go for the data governance and infrastructure fragmentation, because we heard that in all the sectors that we cover, this fragmentation and actually the restrictions and the barriers that are currently in place and block somehow this cross-border sharing of data. These are the challenging pieces that can be addressed. In Europe now, with the European Health Data Space, there is an opportunity to shape this forward. And I think that through this, it will also help the maybe not so developed countries in reducing the inequalities, especially in the healthcare system. So I would go for the data governance and infrastructure interoperability, I would say.
Fantastic. Infrastructure and interoperability. Fiona, over to you.
Yeah, it's a hard question. I think I would second you on that, but also perhaps tie this to, you know, some sort of give-get, right? Like, I think about credit bureau data as an example of there's a give-get, right? I report out on all of the performance of all of these loans, and I get a summary of this person's entire, you know, debt picture. And so is there some sort of give-get concept or construct here? And it doesn't necessarily have to be I get data back. It could be, although that would be very valuable, it could be, a give in terms of an innovation, a sort of a sandbox within which to innovate products and services. Like, hey, where in a highly regulated industry like finance, it is actually hard to innovate and do things. And so anyway, that just thinking conceptually about, is there a give-get for participating in this common pool in terms of what the business could get out of it.
Yeah, that reciprocity concept, and to Juan's earlier points on data as code, maybe data policy, we can think about what those if-then statements would look like is one way to think about it. So Caroline, over to you.
Thanks. Well, I'm just wondering whether regulatory sandboxes could also assist build trust in that open data ecosystem. They offer an opportunity for companies to test new ideas, new technologies, new use cases in a safe and controlled environment while receiving guidance from regulators and hopefully across different countries and maybe even sectors and disciplines. That could have multiple benefits in, first of all, creating new opportunities for innovation, maybe uncovering new challenges that can then be addressed, bring regulators up to speed on these massive opportunities and new technologies that exist out there, build the trust, and maybe build the foundation for smart and effective regulation. So I would actually vote for regulatory sandboxes.
Fantastic. Regulatory sandboxes with one vote here, and certainly makes a lot of sense, especially for bringing those different stakeholders to the table, as you said. And then again, last but not least, over to you, Brennan.
Yeah, I would definitely second Caroline. I think regulatory sandbox is a fantastic idea. And I'll go back to what I mentioned before as another safe, cozy, enclosed place as a safe harbor, right? So I believe even CCPA currently has safe harbor carve-outs around research. I don't think they're very super well defined. But if you can define using these concepts like social license, things that are deemed to be socially acceptable and necessary by a body of citizens, and to create a safe harbor around that, I think would just greatly de-risk companies who don't want to wade into those types of waters.
Fantastic. Well, I think speak for the attendees here in thanking our fantastic panel for all of these incredibly useful reflections and really, I think, actionable kind of insights on how we can take this space forward. And that's ultimately what this summit is really about, which is surfacing some of those insights and lessons learned from different contexts and thinking about how we can translate those into more collective action and a more ecosystemic approach to enabling data reuse, data stewardship, and a third wave of open data. So thank you so much again, Iona, Caroline, Fiona, and Brennan for these fantastic interventions. And thanks again to all the attendees for being here. And now I'm happy to hand it back to Stefan to close out this summit.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks to the panelists and thanks to Andrew for great moderation. And yeah, we've come to the end of our first Open Data Policy State of Open Data Policy Summit, and it remains just to thank everyone who was here. I'm not even going to try to summarize some of the key takeaways here, and I think it was a very rich summit where we now know that data is not the new oil, but the new code, which I think is a really great insight. We've also learned about really focusing on the purpose and being more purpose-driven as it relates to open data, the need for a global approach, but more importantly, a global collaboration in order to, for instance, prevent this level of fragmentation and also to bridge the divide that exists between those that actually have policies and those that need the policies. A lot of the discussion seems to be about incentives and to what extent can we develop tools and approaches to increase incentives, including ways to acknowledge and recognize those that share, but also to perhaps certify the ways on how data is being shared so that we create that kind of trust and ways to really understand how do we limit the risk with, for instance, sharing certain kinds with certain kinds of audiences and actors. And then I think there was a lot of interesting discussion about how do we put people at the center, right? So this whole concept of human-centric, not only human-centric sharing, but also human-centric policies, and how do we even go about this? And these are just a few of the top headlines, I guess, or messages from today's summit. We will process everything that was discussed today and share with you a blog. We also at the Open Data Policy Lab are looking forward to the next range of activities, which will include areas such as developing open data policy labs, where we could actually rapid prototype a few approaches that are currently lacking. Some of those topics that were discussed today may require this kind of multi-stakeholder rapid ideation on how do we actually go forward. And so that's something that we are looking into establishing in the next stage of the Open Data Policy Lab. And for those that are interested in possibly joining some of those Open Data Policy Labs, let us know. We are always eager to learn about others that might be interested in joining our efforts. But with that, let me make sure that we close here on time, or even a minute earlier. This has been 3 hours of non-stop input, which means that we have a lot more time needed to actually process it all. And so thanks for all of those that took part today, the panelists and the keynote speaker that shared all their wisdom and again, shared also their time. They're all very busy people, and we benefit from them sharing and participating in events like this. Thank also to all the participants. Obviously, this is meant to be community building and meant to also make sure that we keep the community around open data alive and have this kind of frank exchange of concerns, but also solutions. And then last but not least, let me thank, of course, the Open Data Policy Lab team here, including Andrew Zaharanik, who was instrumental in getting this pushed, but also, of course, Andrew, Marine, and everyone else that I probably failed to acknowledge that have played a role in today's event as well. And then, of course, above all, thank also Microsoft to be a great partner in our Open Data Policy Lab as well. With that, let me close today's summit and look forward to future summits or future events and ways we can collaborate as it relates to making the reuse and access to data more systematic, sustainable, and above all, responsible as well. Thank you so much, and see you soon.